So we've just started to work with a company which uses artificial intelligence to kind of look for such things from basically financial crime compliance perspective. Right? So that is different aspects of financial crime compliance. So we work with them. We've already done some work in Singapore. We are looking to do work with them in India and a few other markets. So I absolutely believe that they can add value. Ultimately, you have to look into the AI models which are using it and what they are good at, and also complement that with some amount of human intervention as well, because that is also very important, right? What they're suggesting, does it make sense? So we always have AI, but there is a human element to it, which means what we call human-assisted AI. So there is some amount of that.
Welcome to Trade Treasury Payments, the podcast unlocking the future of cross-border finance.
From transaction banking and money movements
to liquidity, treasury, and cash management.
We bring you expert insights and the latest trends shaping global finance.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this podcast on transparency in trade finance. This episode is part of a podcast series on best practice initiatives to improve global supply chains in partnership with the Asian Development Bank's Trade and Supply Chain Finance Program. I'm Joy Macknight, an editorial consultant for the ADB. And with me is Ashutosh Kumar, Managing Director and Head of Global Transaction Banking Department, Asia Pacific at Mizuho Bank. Thanks so much for joining me, Ashutosh.
Thanks, Joy, for having me here.
I think the last time we saw each other was at the Sibos in Frankfurt, when we both participated in a roundtable discussion at the Bankers Association for Finance and Trade, or BAFT. They had a conference on the day before SWIFT user conference began. So it's fantastic to reconnect.
Same here. It was great to catch up at Sibos, and again, good to connect here as well.
Fantastic. So today, the theme of transparency in trade finance focuses primarily on fighting trade-based money laundering, or Tbml, and enhancing integrity in trade transactions. So we're going to look at how the trade finance ecosystem, which includes banks, regulators, multilateral institutions, can really strengthen transparency, compliance, and information sharing, and also highlight ongoing initiatives to promote best practices, knowledge exchange, and technology adoption in this space. So Ashutosh, I was thinking about taking a bit of a step back and start with a high-level question, which is, how do you approach transparency and due diligence within your trade finance operations?
Thanks, Joy, for the question. Right. So before I go into the question, I wanted to spend maybe just a minute to talk about the bank and how we support trade finance per se, and how we work with Asian Development Bank as well. So we are one of the three mega banks from Japan, Mizuho Bank. And, as you would understand, the growth of Japanese bank, right? It was all about supporting trade, or as the Japanese companies moved into different geographies to support the entire supply chain. So this is something which comes very naturally for us. We are now a 150-year-old bank, so we have been supporting this for many, many years, right? So that comes quite naturally. But having said that, right, as we know that there are transactions which could result into what we call trade-based money laundering, and we're very cognizant about that, right? We start from a few principles, right? So even before, the first principle is know your customers. So do we know the exporter or the importer? How well the exporter and importer knows each other. So that is the first one from a supply chain perspective. And then I think that is something which over the years has become a talent or a capability which the bank has. So that is something which we look at, right? Then it is also other parties involved in the transaction, mostly if there's another bank involved, right? So either exporters bank or importers bank, right? And then we do due diligence on them as well. And just understanding how strong or what kind of trade-based money laundering checks they have is very important, right? And in that context, I also see ADB has done a lot of work in that context, and that helps, right? Because many often we deal with banks in emerging markets, and what kind of banks or within the banks, what kind of a systems, processes they have that, and that is something which is quite helpful. We also understand ADB has done a lot of trainings for such banks, especially in South Asia perspective, where the market is growing quite fast. Um, the first one was the corporate, the second one was the bank. And then when the transaction hits, we have our own set of checks, which is typically complying with the regulatory requirements from uh, all our regulators. But more importantly, what we want to make sure is that we are living up to the standards which we have set for ourselves as well. And I think that is where the checks goes in. The operations team will check in terms of what is the transaction about? Do we understand the transaction? Is it in line with the business of the exporter and importer? Are the values in line with what you would typically see in that particular industry or trade or that kind of a thing? So those are the things which we look at, right? So we take, I would say, to sum it up, a very holistic approach towards
Mm.
trade-based money laundering and about transparency and due diligence, rather than just looking at the transaction in isolation.
Excellent. That's super interesting. And you've touched on a lot of topics that I think we can sort of dive in a little bit deeper. Obviously, it's very interesting around the trade-based money laundering specifically. Like, it's been on the radar of banks and regulators for a very long time. And I think it's really rising up the priorities for regulators in terms of their list of priorities. I know, like, I wrote an article in 2019 sort of looking at the challenges banks face when trying to tackle TBML. And this is when criminals use legitimate trade transactions to mask illicit gains and move funds around the world through methods such as multiple invoicing, mispricing goods, and phantom shipments. And I guess even though the banks and the regulators have been looking at this for a long time, there's still been quite an increase in trade-based money laundering activities. For example, the Monetary Authority of Singapore's 2024 Money Laundering National Risk Assessment really highlighted that jump, specifically around TBML. And it stems from the country's position as Asia's leading transportation hub. So maybe let's dive a little bit deeper into really the challenges. So many point to the difficulties stemming from the nature of trade, which involves multiple parties and the multitude of documents, from letters of credits to payment orders. What do you consider to be the biggest challenges banks face in identifying and then preventing TBML, but then also mitigating financial crime risk more broadly?
Yeah, yeah. So I think it's an industry-wide challenge, right?
Mm,
But the way I see it, if you do your homework correctly, if you have identified the counterparties who you are dealing with and done the due diligence on them, then it becomes much more easier. Typically, it starts with knowing your customer. And I think we very strongly believe in it. If you know your customer, that is already a very, very good start, because in knowing the customer, it's not about knowing them and not only knowing their business, but also the counterparties who
mm.
they deal with, right? So we would
Yeah,
have
I
a
was thinking
normal
about I was sorry to interrupt. I was thinking about know your customer's customer. I
yeah,
remember
exactly.
Todd Burwell from BAF saying that.
Yes, yes. So I think that what we call KYCDD, knowing your customer's customer, is quite important, right? And many times when we discuss with our customers, we would like to understand who your big suppliers are, who your big buyers are, who are the top 10 in that, how much trade do you do with them. So that builds the basis of the work which we do, right? Now, reverse of that, if you're not doing that, then it becomes a challenge, because if you're not relying on that, then that becomes a challenge. So I think that is something which we very much rely upon. Um, the second level is, if it is LC related, then we work with banks. Right now, when you work with a bank, you would kind of an exchange RMA with itself. So understanding the whole model of the bank, what kind of a customers are they dealing with is again also very important, right? And that we again we take some work there as well. Right? Now, this is where it becomes a bit challenging because the list of customers which you work on is a finite set of customers. Right? You can understand the customer's customer, but the banks that they deal with are very, very varied, right? And
Mm,
there is a regulatory requirement in terms of how you assess and what you do. So we take that very diligently to manage it. But that is one of the challenges because many times in order to maintain that kind of an what we call RMA is a cost. And if the number of transactions for every bank is not very high, then you need to come up with a model which works. Now, in that context, we have done some work with some other like-minded banks where we leverage each other's network to do that as well. Because rather than we going and doing due diligence, every bank, the other bank is also done due diligence. We understand each other. Our exchange is similar. So can we then leverage each other's network to promote it? So
mm,
that is something which we also do. So there isn't, if you think of that way, I mean, if you just look at Swift Big Bank, right, almost 11,000 bank, right? Doing due diligence on all of that 11,000 is a very, very, very Herculean task. And then
mm,
you have to do on every branch of those banks, right? So rather than doing it that way, we definitely have with thousands and thousands of banks there. We also partner with other banks where we leverage each other's network to manage that. And I think that is something which has helped us in terms of understanding the risk, managing the risk much better, and that is something which we really take a lot of comfort in, a lot of pride in how we manage that.
Hey, enjoying this podcast? Hit that follow button for more. Done? Let's get back to it.
excellent. Because obviously that it has been a big issue in the past, which is really around that information sharing. But I think that's becoming much better between the banks, which is really
Yes.
important and really helps to combat it because obviously, the crime doesn't stop on the border, it goes cross-border, etc. So having that
Yeah.
information sharing cross-border is very key. Um,
Yeah.
a lot of people are now pointing to sort of emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence to really replace that slow, error-prone based systems with secure real-time data digital ecosystems. How do you see the role of data, technology, and collaboration in terms of, helping to enhance transaction transparency?
Yeah. So I think there is already quite a bit of work happening in that area. So I mean, earlier you referred to Singapore, right? If you look at Singapore, there's already a book of work where a lot of banks came together and what is now called trade risk registry, where every bank can share the data and it's a common database. And then it looks for kind of an anomaly. So if the same data is being shared by multiple banks, something is wrong, right? The same
Mm,
bill of lading, the same invoice, then there's something wrong the customer is doing, right? So that kind of, and let's say to prevent double financing, a very simple example, right? But these are the same threat actors which would do multiple things, not just double financing, but also go and do trade-based money laundering, blah, 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 all of that, right? So this kind of sharing of information within banks kind of supported from regulatory or quasi-regulatory, you can say, from a Singapore perspective is very, very helpful. There are some fintech and others who are involved who are managing this at the back end. But this is something which is really helping the industry in terms of bringing all of those things together at one place, right? I personally believe that technology, data sharing, collaboration are the three pillars on which the whole fight against the financial crime risk or trade-based money laundering has to be built around.
mm,
Over the last, I would say 3, 4 years, or even slightly longer than that, I have seen that banks have started to collaborate much more. That is one. The second thing, they've started to use data much more
mm,
because now data is available and you can ingest that data for different purposes, whether it is let's say, trying to identify if this is a genuine trade, right? In terms of, is the invoice amount in line with what you should see for that particular shipment? Is this particular shipment which is going in line with the business of the customer? Are the counterparties, is there any kind of relationship between the counterparties? So all of those information now you can check based on the data or the technology related help. So that is something which helps us quite a bit.
Excellent. And do you think artificial intelligence is really going to, enable a step change in really uncovering, trade-based money laundering?
Yeah. So we've just started to work with a company which uses artificial intelligence to kind of look for such things from basically financial crime compliance perspective, right? So that is different aspects of financial crime compliance. So we work with them. We've already done some work in Singapore. We are looking to work with them in India and a few other markets. So I absolutely believe that they can add value. Ultimately, you have to look into the AI models which are using it and what they are good at, and also complement that with some amount of human intervention as well, because that is also very important, right? What they're suggesting, does it make sense? So we always have um, AI, but there is a human element to it, which means what we call human assisted AI. So there is some amount of that. Um, but having said that, the kind of efficiency which AI brings is really, really good. Somebody going through, line by line or trying to search that, AI can do the same job at a much faster pace, at a much higher scale. And then you have somebody who comes and looks at it, say, yep, I mean, looked at it, what they're saying is makes sense. So it becomes more like a, maker checker, and the maker function is done by AI and the checker function is done by a human.
Excellent. All right, great. Obviously, a lot of the multilateral development banks are also getting involved. What do you think programs such as the ADB's Trade and Supply Chain Finance Program, what role do they play in supporting local banks, for example, to strengthen their compliance frameworks?
Yeah, I think they play a very, very good and a strong role, right? So if you look at ADB themselves, right? So they have got programs in place. If I remember correctly, they have got a regional pilot program with UNODC, where they work with the country's financial intelligence unit, custom authorities, and all of them. I mean, countries like Bangladesh, Mongolia, Nepal, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, right, to really improve the trade-based money laundering detection and reporting it. And these are the countries which are, you can call it emerging markets. But typically, you would want them to be having a similar standard as any international bank. So I think that is a role which ADB plays, not only in terms of partnering, but also training these people on trade-based money laundering, what are the red flags, how to identify transactions, how to make enforcement. If I remember, they had also done some work in terms of um, identifying fields in the STR, or the suspicious activity, suspicious transaction reporting framework. So all of these things. So if you think there's a work in terms of training or making awareness, as well as standardizing things. So I think that is all going to help. And I think that is something which is quite helpful for any international bank to understand and take comfort from, that an organization like ADB is involved and really driving the agenda on that.
Excellent. Yeah, it's all that capacity building, really, isn't it? And bringing
Absolutely.
local banks up to the standards of the international banks, which is really important. And then because, like in anything, the weakest link is the biggest problem, really. So to bring
Absolutely.
everybody, sort of all boats are rising in terms of that ability to really look at that transaction transparency. Okay. So the next question I had, which is really about sort of real life examples of what Mizuho Bank is doing, and also then what are the lessons learned when implementing stronger due diligence and KYC frameworks?
Yeah. So let me start with the second part first, the lessons learned
Mm,
from stronger due diligence and KYC, and then um, I'll go, what we are doing, right? As an example. So as we implemented these things, right? So we realized that um, it becomes much more cumbersome to do these due diligence, right? So and that was something which we said, okay, we need to focus on um, where we can really make a difference in terms
mm,
of banks, by transactions, by size. So we focused on that, right? And then we realized there was a certain set of transactions or banks we were finding it difficult to support because the cost of doing the due diligence, the KYC, the frameworks was quite um, different. So that is where we partnered with a bank, uh, and we said, let's complement each other.
mm,
You are particularly very good in a particular geography. We are very good in a particular geography. And wherever possible, can I leverage your due diligence by not doing it, but simply by routing the transactions through you?
mm,
It's fairly simple. So rather than I going and establishing RMA with every bank, to
mm,
7,000 banks, I've got 5,000 RMAs, just as an example, right? You've got another 5,000. Can I use where I don't have, where there is a difference? You have some, I don't have those. I have some which you don't have. So for those which you have and I don't have, can I use your network to send transactions? So it still goes through. They become the intermediary, and it goes through. So that way, we still have to pay fees for that, but that fees is more of um, a variable cost rather than having a huge fixed cost even
mm,
when transactions are not there. So and that in many ways become win-win for both of us because they have invested into an infrastructure, we have invested in infrastructure, and we maximize the use of it and leverage each other's expertise. So that is something which I think is working quite well for us. We're looking to do some more partnerships in that area with some other banks. I
mm,
mean, this one is quite well known, so it is out in the public. We did with Bank of New York.
mm.
So that is something which is there. And we've received awards for that as well, right? So this is quite a good thing which we have done.
Excellent. That's fantastic. I think that's so good. And again, like you said, it's a win-win because you're leveraging each other's expertise, etc. So fantastic. All right. Well, we're on to my last question, which is a bit of a shame because I really think we could have gone on and talked about this topic for a very long time. But looking ahead, how do you see transparency shaping the evolution of trade finance in Asia?
Yeah. So I see this shaping in two forms, right? One of them is the trade-based money laundering and the work which is happening on it, on financial crime compliance. But what is also happening in the industry, there's a lot of work happening on digitization of trade, right? As trade gets more and more digitized, transparency naturally will improve
Mm,
because accessibility or accessibility towards data will really go high, right? And there is a lot of work which is happening on that, whether it is work done by multiple parties involved, including ADB taking a leadership role in terms of interoperability standards. So what is happening is there are certain documents which is involved in an export or import, and can we standardize those documents, and then everybody understands that, right? So that is something which is happening. If that happens, then you know that uh, uh, agreed set of information will always be shared, and then the whole transparency goes up, and that is right. The second thing is also acceptability of that through legal standards or the adoption of MLETR. I think that once it happens, then you will have much more trade documents being exchanged digitally. As a result, those information, there is no manual intervention required. It'll be all done through technology and system. The role of AI can be very much enhanced. You are no
mm,
longer scanning a document which is read by OCR and then AI comes in. Have the underlying data in your systems because the document itself is a digital document. So you can
mm,
pick it up. So this is something which is another work happening. So I would say the combination of use of technology and digitalization of trade along with the trade-based money laundering frameworks, and all of that coming together would really improve transparency. I think a lot of good work is happening on that, right? I think um, maybe in the next 5 to 7 years, we will see a lot of uh, um, I think it's more than evolution, really pioneering work happening in this area, which will help us in terms of trade finance, make it much more safer, much more secure for the entire ecosystem, not just for banks, but banks, regulators, corporates, exporters, importers, shipping companies, everybody involved in that, and then betterment from a society perspective as well.
Excellent. Because I guess at the end of the day, that's the big impact, isn't it, on society itself? Yeah. So I think that's such important points that you've made there. Well, thank you so much for your insights, Ashutosh. I thought it was a brilliant podcast. So thank you so much. And thanks to our audience for listening. This podcast is produced in partnership with the Asian Development Bank's Trade and Supply Chain Finance Program. Thanks again.
Thanks, Joy. Thanks everyone for listening.
And don't forget to follow Trade Treasury Payments
on your favorite podcast platform.
Thanks for listening.